I've always prided myself on being perceptive, whether it's reading a room at work or understanding my wife, Clara. We'd built a good life together. Successful careers, a beautiful home, a strong partnership. But lately, something had been off. It started small. Clara working late more often, distant when we were together, spending more time out with friends. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe she was just stressed from work, or maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then one night, I was at a business dinner, standing at the bar waiting for a drink, when I overheard a conversation between two women at the next table. They were talking about Elliot, a colleague I trusted, someone I'd worked closely with for years. At first, it just seemed like gossip, but then I heard them mention how Elliot and Clara had been having an affair. Not just a fling, but something serious, something planned. They'd been seeing each other for months. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but the more they talked, the more it became clear. Clara, my wife, was involved with him. They were building something together behind my back. I didn't confront her immediately. I needed to be sure. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore it. I had to know if what I'd overheard was true. So, I started watching. Clara's late nights, her excuses, the way she acted like nothing was wrong. Something inside me twisted. This wasn't just a passing thing. It was bigger, deeper. And then, when I found her journal, full of confessions about her love for Elliot and plans for their future, it all clicked. This wasn't just an affair. She was planning a future without me. They'd been working together to tear down everything we'd built. I could have confronted her right then, but I didn't. Not yet. I needed to think this through, and I needed to wait for the right moment. Because when the time came, I wasn't going to let her off easy. It would have been easier to confront Clara right away. Yell, scream, demand answers. But that's not who I was. I couldn't let my emotions control me like that. No, I needed to be smarter. I had to play it cool. I'd always been perceptive, patient, methodical. So, that's what I did. I waited. Clara's routine stayed the same. More late nights at work, more time away with friends. When I asked her about it, her excuses were weak. It's just a late meeting, or I have to go out with the team. But the lies were obvious, and her attempts to cover them up were getting worse. Still, I acted like everything was fine. I didn't call her out on it. Not yet. I started to watch her more closely, noticing all the small things, like how she'd stare at her phone and quickly hide it when I walked by. Or how, when we'd talk, she'd seem distant, as though her mind was elsewhere. The trust I'd had in her was starting to crack, but I couldn't just jump to conclusions without proof. I needed to know for sure. One evening, after another of her work dinners, I couldn't help myself. I went through her bag. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed something concrete. That's when I found her journal. At first, it seemed like harmless stuff. Lists, reminders, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I flipped a few pages, and there it was, Clara's thoughts about Elliot. Their affair. How long it had been going on, how serious it was, and worst of all, her plans for the future with him. It wasn't a one-time mistake. This was calculated. She had already decided. She was going to leave me. The worst entry talked about their plans together. How she'd been careful, how she'd managed to keep up the charade of the perfect wife while quietly falling in love with Elliot. She was already imagining a life with him, without me. I didn't even know how long I sat there, reading it. Anger, betrayal, confusion, they all hit me like a freight train. But I still didn't confront her. Not yet. I wasn't done. I needed to know more. I needed her to slip up in a way I couldn't ignore. So, I stayed quiet. I kept watching. And as much as it hurt, I started to plan. I wasn't just going to scream at her. I wasn't going to make a scene. No, I was going to make sure she felt the consequences of what she'd done. And I wasn't going to do it recklessly. I would wait carefully, until I had everything in place. She had no idea what was coming. I wasn't blind to the signs anymore. Clara's late nights had become routine. Every time I asked her about them, the excuses were the same. Another late meeting, or the team needs me. But there was something off in her voice, something guarded in her eyes. I could feel the distance between us growing, even if she wasn't willing to admit it. I needed more. The gossip I overheard at the business dinner had been the first red flag, but it wasn't enough. I needed concrete proof. So I started paying closer attention, watching for anything that might reveal the truth. Then came the night I found it. Clara had gone out again. Another work event, or catching up with friends. I couldn't keep track anymore. I was tired of waiting for her to slip up, so tonight, I decided I wasn't just going to sit at home. I headed to her study. It was a room I didn't often go into, but tonight I felt compelled to look. The door was unlocked, and I stepped inside. Clara had always kept it neat, but now it felt like an unfamiliar place. Her desk was cluttered with work papers, but as I sifted through the mess, something caught my eye. A small envelope, tucked under a pile of receipts. It was addressed to Clara, but the handwriting was different. I opened it cautiously, half expecting a bill or something mundane. Instead, inside was a one-way plane ticket. It was for a flight to a city I knew she hadn't mentioned. A flight leaving the day after her last work dinner. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. Why would she be going there? And why wouldn't she tell me? I didn't stop there. I rummaged through her desk some more and found a file folder hidden behind a drawer. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were printed emails between Clara and Elliot. The first email was casual. Just talk about work and scheduling. But as I read more, the tone changed. The emails became more personal, even flirtatious. They talked about places they wanted to visit together, how they'd arrange their schedules to see each other when I wasn't around. One email even mentioned booking a hotel room for an upcoming business trip. It hit me hard. This wasn't a one-time affair. It was something ongoing. They had been planning this, setting it up carefully, and I had been blind to it. The truth was right there in front of me. Clara wasn't just having a fling with Elliot. She was planning a life with him. I closed the folder, trying to calm the knot in my stomach. I wasn't angry yet, just numb. It was like watching someone else's life fall apart. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was the end of everything I thought I knew. Clara came home that night, acting like nothing had changed. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my day had been, but I could feel the tension. She knew I knew. The silence between us was louder than any confrontation could have been. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I wasn't ready to confront her. I needed time. But now, I had everything I needed. The truth was out. And I was already starting to plan what came next. The next few days felt like I was walking through a fog. I couldn't look at Clara without seeing the lie in her eyes. But I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I had everything I needed. Proof, motive, a plan. I just had to bide my time. Keep playing the part of the dutiful husband until the moment was right. Clara acted like everything was fine, of course. She carried on with her usual routine, coming and going with excuses that were getting harder to swallow. But now, every time she walked out the door, I felt something else underneath the surface. A part of me wanted to scream, to call her out right there, but I knew that wouldn't get me what I wanted. If I was going to make her feel the weight of what she'd done, I had to be patient. It was all about control. I had to keep mine while she was losing hers. The first step was Elliot. I knew he was just as much a part of this as Clara. I'd worked with him for years, and though we were friendly, I could tell there was always something a little too smooth about him. Too polished. He'd always been the type to keep his personal life tightly under wraps. But I also knew that meant there were cracks, things he'd tried to hide. And it was time to expose them. I started with his professional life. I knew his weaknesses. Elliot had a reputation for being a little too ambitious, too eager to climb the ladder. He'd done things that were questionable, things that hadn't quite reached the light of day. But I knew the board, and I knew his key clients. I knew where the skeletons were buried. I began feeding subtle hints, dropping small pieces of information to people who mattered. Information about his financial dealings, about certain shady business practices that hadn't been widely known. Nothing outright illegal, but just enough to make people question his integrity. Soon, the whispers started. Clients began to pull back. Board members started to ask questions. Elliot was suddenly under scrutiny, his reputation starting to unravel. Meanwhile, Clara remained oblivious. living her life as if nothing had changed. But I wasn't done with her yet. It was time to start applying pressure in a more personal way. I started using my influence in her social circle. I wasn't going to spread the word outright, but I made sure certain things got leaked, things I knew would make her friends start asking questions. Private details about her affair that I knew she'd never wanted anyone to find out. I told a few people about the hotel, about the trip she'd planned with Elliot, and about the way they'd been talking behind closed doors. Slowly but surely, the people Clara trusted began to question her. The trust she had with them began to fracture, and soon she was isolated. The friends who had once stood by her started to pull away. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Watching her squirm in the growing silence, I realized how much satisfaction I was getting out of it. She had no idea what was coming next. She didn't even know the real damage had started. When I could feel the weight of the pressure mounting, I started to set the stage for the final blow. I could see it in Clara's eyes, the unease, the guilt, and the way she tried to cover it with fake smiles. But I wasn't fooled. Every day, I watched her unravel, her carefully constructed walls crumbling. She still didn't know that I knew. I wasn't about to let her off the hook. Meanwhile, the pressure on Elliot was starting to show. The whispers had grown, and his professional life was falling apart. Clients were pulling back. The board was asking tough questions. His perfect career was slipping through his fingers, and it was all because of the subtle moves I'd made. He had no idea who was behind it, and that was the best part. Watching him squirm was just the beginning. But it wasn't enough yet. I needed to take things further. Elliot's career was in freefall, but I wasn't just targeting his job. I wanted everything he held dear. So, I went after the one thing that would hurt him the most: his relationships with the company's clients. I quietly reached out to a key client he'd worked with for years. I didn't need to say much, just a little hint about some questionable financial decisions he'd made in the past. I made sure it was the right person to pass the information along. Soon, the rumors started flying, and Elliot's reputation was shot. Contracts he had worked so hard for were cancelled. Deals he thought were locked in were suddenly off the table. He was left scrambling, trying to save face, but by then, it was already too late. The best part? I didn't even need to confront him directly. I just let the whispers do the work. Watching him lose everything felt oddly satisfying, but it wasn't the end. It was only the first step. Now it was time for Clara. She had been dealing with the fallout from her affair, losing friends, facing subtle but pointed questions, and realizing the people she trusted were starting to pull away. But I wasn't done with her yet. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done. I began planting rumors in her circle. I reached out to a few of her closest friends, casually mentioning how she and Elliot had been getting too comfortable at work events, exchanging texts, even making plans for their future together. I didn't have to say much, just enough to make them question her. I made sure the right people heard it. It didn't take long for Clara's friends to start distancing themselves. Some questioned her choices, others just pulled away quietly. I could see the isolation beginning, and I knew she was starting to realize the consequences of her actions, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. Watching her suffer in silence, without any direct confrontation from me, was part of the plan. She was losing everything slowly, and I wasn't going to give her the closure she expected. No tearful talks. No emotional confessionals. This was about showing her what it felt like to have everything fall apart, piece by piece. The real blow was still coming. The time had come. The pieces were all in place, and I could feel the tension building. Clara's social circle was falling apart, Elliot's career was crumbling, and I had been playing the part of the unsuspecting husband. But now, it was time for the final blow. I had to hit them where it hurt most. Publicly. There was an important company event coming up, one that Clara and Elliot were both heavily involved in. It was the perfect stage for what I had planned. Everyone who mattered would be there. Board members, clients, colleagues. I knew I could expose them both in the worst possible way. I spent days setting things up, leaking just enough of their affair to the media to make sure it reached the right people. I didn't want them to know I was behind it, but I wanted to make sure the story broke at the perfect moment. It needed to hit them hard, while they were in the spotlight at the event. The night of the event arrived, and Clara was her usual polished self, smiling, laughing, acting like everything was fine. She and Elliot were the perfect professional couple, all charm and confidence. What they didn't know was that their world was about to come crashing down. As the night went on, I could see the moment the media caught wind of the story. Phones buzzed. People whispered. Clara's face drained of color as she realized what was happening. Elliot tried to keep his cool, but I saw the crack in his facade. They were both exposed, their affair laid bare for everyone to see. It didn't take long for the whispers to turn into full-blown headlines. By the end of the evening, Clara was a shadow of the confident woman she had been. People avoided her. Their colleagues and clients started pulling away. Elliot, his career was officially over. The media had a field day, and his reputation, once spotless, was shattered. I didn't have to say a word. Their reactions said it all. They had been exposed in the worst way possible, right in front of everyone they'd worked so hard to impress. Clara came to me that night, desperate, broken, asking what was happening. But I didn't answer. Instead, I handed her the letter, the one that confirmed she was fired, effective immediately. The affair had reached the board, and there was no coming back from it. She stood there, in shock, her world falling apart. She didn't even try to plead with me. She knew it was over. And me? I didn't need to gloat. I had taken everything from them both. Careers, reputations, friends. I had made them feel what it was like to lose everything, slowly, painfully. I walked away that night with nothing but the quiet satisfaction that they had learned the hardest lesson of all. Betrayal, once revealed, can never be undone. The days after the event were quiet, almost too quiet. Clara didn't reach out, and I didn't expect her to. What could she possibly say? The silence felt heavy between us, but strangely, it was a relief. Everything had come to an end, and I hadn't even had to raise my voice. The life we built together, the lies, the betrayal, was gone. Elliot, he vanished. His career was in ruins, and the last I heard, he'd fled the country, trying to escape the wreckage. His name was tarnished, and he was nowhere to be found, hiding from the consequences of his actions. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing he'd lost everything, just like I had. Clara, on the other hand, tried to pick up the pieces, but it was already too late. Her social life, once full of support, turned to dust. Friends who once trusted her now avoided her. Her attempts to play the victim fell flat, and no one was buying her story. The affair had destroyed her reputation, and the whispers that had started at the event only grew louder. The woman who once seemed untouchable was now a cautionary tale. But what was most satisfying was that Clara still didn't fully understand what had happened. She thought I would be angry, that I would scream, or beg for her forgiveness. But I wasn't angry. I had already taken everything from her, and I hadn't raised a single finger. I was in control the entire time, and she was the one left in the wreckage. A week after the event, Clara showed up at the house. I hadn't invited her, but there she was, standing at the door, looking exhausted. She didn't even need to say anything. I could see it in her eyes. She was broken, and she knew it. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, staring at her. The woman who once stood beside me, who had made a life with me, was now standing before me. Lost, empty. She had destroyed everything, including herself. "What's left to talk about?" I finally said, my voice colder than I intended. There was nothing to fix, nothing to save. It was over. She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I said nothing. What could I say? She had already lost everything. Her career, her reputation, her friends. I wasn't going to comfort her. There was nothing left to repair. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, she turned to leave. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't beg. She just left, and I didn't stop her. I didn't follow her. I didn't even call after her. I knew she would have to live with the consequences of her choices for the rest of her life. As for me, I was done. The weeks after Clara and Elliot had been exposed felt oddly peaceful. Life went on, but it felt different. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't feel like I had been wronged, just that I had been freed. There was a weight lifted, one I hadn't realized I'd been carrying all those years. Clara's attempts to reach out stopped after a while. The calls, the messages, they all died down. No one returned her texts or offered her comfort. She had burned every bridge, and I didn't need to be a part of her crumbling world anymore. I stayed in the house we'd shared, but something about it had changed. The memories of the life we had built together didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a place that belonged to someone else. So, I started making small changes, moving things around, throwing out old stuff. The house began to feel like my space again, and with each change, I felt more and more like I was putting the past behind me. Work became a new focus. I threw myself into it, not to escape the pain, but because it felt good to be good at something again. The success I found at work gave me confidence, reminded me that I could still build something, even without her. I was still capable. Then, one afternoon, I got a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Clara. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, and something about seeing her name on my screen sent a wave of emotions through me. She had reached out before, but this felt different. There was no pretense, no excuses, just a simple plea for closure. "Can we talk? I need closure. Please." I stared at the screen for a long time. Closure. It felt almost laughable. She had been the one to betray me, and now she wanted closure? I had nothing left to give her. I'd already given everything. My love, my trust, and she had destroyed it all. What could I say to make any of this better? I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit there. Part of me considered replying, just to hear what she had to say, but another part knew there was no point. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. I didn't owe her anything. After a while, I deleted the message. I didn't block her number, but I didn't need to. She was already gone from my life. The real closure was in realizing I didn't need her anymore. She had taken everything from herself. I didn't have to do anything else. The next few months were a blur of small victories. I got ahead at work, made new connections, started rebuilding my life. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't need anything from Clara. I was finally moving on, not because I had to, but because it was the only choice left. I don't know where Clara is now. I don't care. She's a ghost in my past, and as for me, I'm done looking back. I'm living for today and the future. The past is where it belongs. Behind me. Life moves on, even when everything feels like it's fallen apart. In the months after Clara and Elliot, I had days where I'd catch myself reflecting, but it didn't sting like it used to. At first, I wondered if I'd somehow missed the signs, if I had been a bad husband. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The betrayal wasn't on me, it was on her. She made her choices. It wasn't about what I could have done differently. Clara chose to lie, to cheat, and to destroy everything we had. And I couldn't have stopped that. I had always thought of myself as perceptive, good at reading people, seeing the warning signs. But I never saw Clara's affair coming. In hindsight, I could see the small cracks, the late nights, the distance, the little lies. But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that the woman I trusted most could hurt me like that. So, I ignored the signs. I convinced myself everything was fine, even when it wasn't. When the truth came to light, it shook me. But once the dust settled, I realized something important. Betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship, it shatters your sense of self. For a while, I questioned everything. Was I not enough? Had I failed as a husband? But I eventually understood that it wasn't my fault. Clara made a choice. She betrayed me, and there was nothing I could have done to stop it. Moving on wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting that the person I thought I knew, the life I thought we had, was all a lie. There was no good reason for her betrayal, no explanation that could ever make it okay. So, I stopped looking for one. The hardest part was not the betrayal itself, but realizing that I couldn't change it. All I could do was decide what came next. What came next was me. I started to rebuild, not the life we'd had, but my life. I didn't need Clara to move forward. I didn't need anyone who could hurt me like that. I had to trust myself again, learn to trust people again. It wasn't easy. There were days I missed what we had, what I thought we had. But with time, I realized I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. I didn't need revenge to heal. I didn't need to punish Clara or Elliot. What mattered was what I did with the mess they left behind. And what I did was move on. Little by little, I started to find peace again. I built something new, something stronger. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, but it was my life. In the end, I realized the greatest victory wasn't in the consequences I imposed on them. It was in the way I took control of my own life again. I had been broken, but I wasn't staying broken. Clara and Elliot were now a part of my past, something I'd never forget but didn't need to carry. I was free, and that was all I needed to know. It's funny how quickly you adapt to a new reality. At first, everything felt like a foreign world. The house, the work, the friends I thought I still had, all of it was colored by the past, by Clara's betrayal. But over time, I started to realize that I wasn't just living in the aftermath of what happened. I was building something new. I started taking better care of myself, physically and emotionally. I'd always been the kind of guy who focused on work, pushing personal stuff to the side. But now, I realized how much I had neglected myself in the process of trying to keep everything else together. So, I started going to the gym, taking care of my health, and paying attention to the things I'd once let slip. I didn't owe it to anyone except myself. I reconnected with old friends, those I hadn't seen in years, who had dropped off after Clara and I got together. It felt good to laugh again, to not have to pretend everything was fine. I met new people too, and with them came new experiences. I didn't rush into anything. I wasn't looking for love, but I enjoyed the feeling of being seen and appreciated for who I was now, not the man I had been with Clara. But the most important thing I did was start living for myself again. I stopped letting the past dictate my future. The loss I felt, the anger, all of it, it had been a part of me for so long. But with time, I started to realize it didn't have to define me. I didn't need Clara to feel whole. I didn't need to keep proving anything to anyone. I just needed to be the man I was meant to be, independent and at peace with my own decisions. I think that's what surprised me the most. How quickly I found a sense of freedom. There were times when the bitterness crept in, when I'd think about what Clara had taken from me, what she had destroyed. But those moments didn't last. I'd remind myself that I was better off. That everything that had happened had forced me to see things differently, to grow. In the months that followed, I found myself thinking less and less about Clara. She had her own path to follow now, and whatever that looked like, it wasn't something I needed to be a part of. I still wondered sometimes where she was, what she was doing, but it wasn't out of a desire to know or to make things right. It was just curiosity, the kind of curiosity you feel when you know the other person in the story has moved on too. I hadn't heard from her in a while, and I didn't care. The silence was exactly what I needed. It wasn't like the silence of before, when I had pretended everything was fine, hoping things would go back to normal. This silence was mine. The silence of a man who had reclaimed his life. And so, I kept moving forward. I wasn't perfect, but I was healing. I was building a life that wasn't defined by Clara or her betrayal. I was learning to trust again, not in people but in myself. I'd made it through the hardest part, and now it was time to focus on what came next. Whatever that was, I was ready for it. A year had passed since everything had fallen apart, and in many ways, I felt like a different person. Clara and Elliot were now just faded memories, no longer occupying my mind. Life had finally started to feel like mine again, and I was beginning to let go of the past. I made a conscious decision not to rush into anything new. I wasn't looking for a rebound or trying to prove to anyone that I could move on. I just wanted to focus on what truly made me feel whole, things I had neglected for too long. One of the first things I did was return to hobbies I had forgotten about. Hiking, for example. I had always enjoyed it, but it had fallen by the wayside over the years. It felt good to be out in nature, to disconnect and clear my mind. Hiking wasn't just about getting exercise. It was a way to process everything without the pressure of my past weighing on me. There were moments on the trails when I felt completely free, like the weight of everything that had happened was behind me. I also started traveling again. I hadn't taken a trip since Clara and I had stopped going on our annual getaways. My first solo trip was to the Pacific Northwest, to get away from everything. It was just what I needed. No memories, no expectations. I remember standing on a cliff looking out over the ocean, feeling like I was starting fresh. The world was wide open, and I was finally free to explore it on my own terms. At work, I found a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't pushing myself to prove anything to anyone anymore, but I was still succeeding. I was taking on bigger projects and making a name for myself in ways I hadn't done before. It wasn't just about career success, it was about finding fulfillment in doing what I was good at, without all the old pressures hanging over me. The most important change, though, was that I started letting people in again. For months, I'd kept everyone at arm's length, afraid of being hurt. But gradually, I opened myself up to friendships. There was one person in particular, Maya, who became a close friend. We had met through work, and over time, I realized that there was a deeper connection between us. It wasn't romantic at first, just a genuine friendship, but it was enough to remind me that I was capable of trusting someone again. Maya made me feel like I could have a future where I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized how much stronger I had become. The betrayal, the pain, it had forced me to grow. I had learned to trust myself again, to let go of the past, and to open up to new possibilities. I wasn't the same person I had been before Clara, but that wasn't a bad thing. I had built something better out of the ruins. Clara was no longer part of my life. I didn't need revenge or closure from her. I was at peace with the way things had turned out, because in the end, it had given me the chance to rebuild. The future was still unwritten, but I was ready for whatever came next. Time has a way of teaching you things you don't expect. After a year of rebuilding my life, I realized I'd learned something important. Forgiveness. Not of Clara or Elliot, but of myself. When you've been betrayed, it's easy to feel like you missed something, like you should have seen it coming. For a long time, I wrestled with that. But in quiet moments, I came to understand that surviving was the most important thing. I hadn't failed, I'd lived through it, and in doing so, I'd become stronger. I ran into Clara one day at the grocery store. I didn't expect it, but there she was, standing at the end of an aisle, looking just like she did when everything fell apart. My heart sank at first, and that familiar anger flared up. But then I realized something had shifted inside me. The anger didn't consume me like it once did. We made eye contact, and I could see the tension in her, like she was waiting for something. An apology, maybe, or a confrontation. But I gave her nothing. I just nodded and kept walking. No words, no drama, just a quiet acknowledgement. I was done. She tried to ask about the house, if I was still living there, but it was clear she was fishing for something deeper. I didn't bite. After a few awkward moments, I simply walked away. That interaction hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a cathartic release. It was just a small, quiet moment that told me everything I needed to know. I didn't need anything from her anymore. No closure, no apology. I had moved on, and the peace I had found came from within, not from her. It made me realize that forgiveness wasn't about letting Clara off the hook. It was about reclaiming my own peace. I had spent so long wondering if I needed some final moment to let go, but the truth was, I already had. I didn't need her approval or her acknowledgement. I could forgive myself for letting it go on as long as I did, and move forward without looking back. That lesson also changed how I viewed relationships. I couldn't let Clara's betrayal poison everything. I had to believe that love, when it was real, could be trusted again. Slowly, I started to open myself up to the idea of relationships again, but I didn't rush it. I had learned that love should come naturally, without pressure. Maya was still around. We'd become close friends, but I didn't push for more. We laughed, enjoyed each other's company, and took things one step at a time. There was no rush. I wasn't ready for another relationship yet, but I realized that when the time was right, I could love again. And that felt like enough. Clara had taken a lot from me, but I had rebuilt what I lost. I had learned that betrayal could break you, but it didn't have to define you. Trust could be rebuilt, and love could come again. I didn't need revenge, or for Clara and Elliot to feel sorry. I was at peace, and that was all I needed. Just when I thought I was truly past everything, done with the anger, the hurt, the memories, life had a way of reminding me that moving on isn't a straight line. I'd been healing, reconnecting with people, exploring new hobbies, and learning to trust again. But I wasn't sure if I was ready for anything deeper. Until Maya came into the picture. At first, it was casual. Just two people reconnecting, sharing laughs, spending time together. But over time, I couldn't ignore it. What I had with Maya wasn't just friendship. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, and those quiet moments together felt easier than anything I'd experienced in a long time. I didn't expect it, but it started to feel like something more. I'll admit, I was hesitant. There was always that fear of getting hurt again, of making myself vulnerable. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep living in fear of the past. To move forward, I had to take a chance. And slowly, we began exploring what this could be. There was no rush. We took our time, but the connection between us was undeniable. I still had doubts though. It was hard not to compare Maya to Clara, especially after everything I'd been through. But the more I got to know her, the more I realized how different she was. Maya wasn't playing games. She was honest, genuine, and open in ways I had forgotten were possible. One night, as we were having dinner, she asked me, "Do you think you'll ever be able to fully trust again?" I didn't know how to answer at first. Trust had been broken so completely in the past, and part of me still wasn't sure if I could ever let myself be fully vulnerable again. But as I sat there with her, looking into her eyes, I realized something. I was ready. Not for perfection but for something real. "I think I'm getting there," I said quietly. "I'm not sure I'll ever be fully unguarded, but I'm trying." That was enough. No promises, no pressure, just the truth. And it felt right. The more time we spent together, the more I understood that moving on wasn't a single moment of clarity. It was a process. I didn't have to forget the past, but I could accept it. The pain, the betrayal, they'd happened, but they didn't define me. I did. And as for Clara, well, she was a ghost now. I didn't need closure or an apology from her. What mattered was that I had moved on, that I had rebuilt my life, and that I was finally able to see a future that wasn't haunted by the past. Things with Maya weren't perfect. Life rarely is, but they didn't need to be. I wasn't looking for perfection. I was looking for something real. And I was starting to find it with her. Months went by, and the weight of the past began to fade. The pain and betrayal didn't consume me anymore. I had learned to accept them as part of my story, but they no longer defined me. Life, I realized, still had plenty of possibilities. Maya and I had grown closer. What started as a simple friendship had become something deeper. We didn't rush anything, but the connection between us was undeniable. We spent more time together, learning more about each other, sharing both light moments and more serious talks. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. One afternoon, we were sitting in a cafe, the sunlight pouring in. We'd been talking about our pasts and where we saw our futures. It was an easy conversation, but there was an underlying depth to it. Maya looked at me and said, "I can see how much you've changed. It's like the guy I first met is still here, but he's different. Better." I didn't know how to respond at first. The truth was, I wasn't sure who I had been before all this happened. But Maya was right. I had changed, not just because of the betrayal, but because I had chosen to move forward. I had learned to grow from it, not let it define me. "I don't know if I'm better," I said, "but I'm definitely different. I've learned to let go of the things that were holding me back." Maya smiled, but there was something bittersweet in her expression. "That's what makes you stronger," she said. "You've let go of the past, but you're not running from it. You've made peace with it." And she was right. For so long, I had tried to escape the hurt, the anger, and the memories. But now, I had made peace with them. I didn't need the past to define me anymore. I was more than the guy who'd been betrayed. I was a man who had survived it. It felt like a new chapter. Maya and I weren't rushing into anything, but we were taking our time, building something solid. We both knew the future was uncertain, but for the first time, I was looking forward to it. Clara. She was still out there somewhere, but she was no longer part of my world. I didn't need to keep track of her life or wonder if she regretted anything. What mattered was that I had moved on. I didn't need closure from her. I had finally reached a place where I didn't need her apology. I was at peace, and that was enough. Life was unpredictable, but it still held potential. I wasn't afraid of what could come next. I had learned that the things we go through don't have to define us, but they shape us in ways we don't always see. With Maya, I wasn't sure where things would go, but I was okay with that. I was learning to let things unfold naturally. Whatever happened, I knew I was stronger, wiser, and at peace with myself. The past was behind me, and for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to whatever came next. It had been nearly a year since everything fell apart. I had rebuilt my life piece by piece, and as much as I had moved forward, there were still days when the memories crept in. The weight of the betrayal never fully disappeared, but it no longer held the same power over me. The scars remained, but they weren't as fresh anymore. And, honestly, they didn't hurt as much as they once did. Maya and I had become something real. We hadn't rushed into anything, but we were getting closer. I wasn't ready to say I loved her, but I cared about her deeply. She had helped me find my way back to trusting people again, and for that, I would always be grateful. I had made peace with Clara's betrayal, but I had also accepted that I would never get the closure I had once hoped for. Clara had never come to me, never apologized, never acknowledged the damage she caused. And at first, I had wanted that. Wanted her to see the pain she put me through. But as time went on, I realized I didn't need her to face it. I didn't need her to admit anything to me. What mattered was how I chose to move on. And that's exactly what I did. I walked away from that chapter of my life, not with anger, but with acceptance. It wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about accepting it for what it was and refusing to let it control me anymore. I hadn't heard from Clara in months. The last time I saw her, she looked different. More lost, less sure of herself. I didn't feel sorry for her. If anything, I felt pity. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. It wasn't my problem anymore. I was done carrying that weight. But the most important thing I learned was this. Letting go isn't just about walking away from the people who hurt you. It's about walking away from the anger, the bitterness, the need for revenge, and giving yourself the freedom to move forward. And that's what I did. I let go of everything that was holding me back. Clara, the past, the pain, and I made room for something new. One evening, Maya and I were sitting in the park, talking about everything and nothing. She asked me, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had turned out differently?" I looked at her and thought about it for a moment. I wasn't going to lie, I had wondered. But the truth was, I didn't dwell on it anymore. What mattered was where I was now, with Maya, and where I was going. The past was just that. The past. I don't know, I said, but I'm not focused on that anymore. I'm focused on today. Maya smiled, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. There were no more questions, no more doubts. Just two people, figuring things out together, in the present. The past would always be a part of me, but I had finally learned that it didn't have to control my future. I was free, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.